September 1945. On the outskirts of a quiet British port, rows of unfamiliar trucks sit motionless. Their paint is faded olive drab, their markings stenciled in American measurements. Some are missing tires, others have engines seized by salt air. Dock workers walk past them without comment. No ceremonies mark their presence. No one records their final inventory. They are simply waiting in finished business from a war that has already ended. The war in Europe has been over for 4 months. Germany surrendered in May. Japan followed in August. Britain emerges victorious, but financially exhausted. 6 years of total war have drained its industry, its treasury, and much of its transport infrastructure. Railways are worn down, commercial lorry fleets are depleted, fuel is rationed, yet scattered across Britain are tens of thousands of military vehicles that do not technically belong to Britain at all. They are the trucks of Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease program began in March 1941, when the United States was not yet a combatant. Britain stood alone against Germany. The Battle of the Atlantic threatened to sever supply lines. British industry was operating at maximum capacity, but it could not replace losses fast enough. Trucks, in particular, were a critical weakness. Britain entered the war with a fragmented civilian haulage sector and limited standardized military vehicle production. Under Lend-Lease, the United States agreed to supply war material without immediate payment. By 1945, the program would deliver over 400,000 vehicles to Britain and the Commonwealth. The majority were simple, durable, mass-produced machines designed to move men, fuel, ammunition, and food across continents. These vehicles were never intended to be glamorous. They were intended to work. By mid-1942, American trucks were arriving in large numbers. Ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow handled constant convoys of crated vehicles. Some were assembled on arrival, others were shipped fully built. They came in standardized types: 2.5-ton cargo trucks, 1.5-ton lorries, tankers, wreckers, and artillery tractors. The most common was the 2.5-ton 6.6 truck, known informally by its load class rather than its manufacturer. By 1944, American-built trucks formed the backbone of British and Commonwealth motor transport units in North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, and the Far East. The scale was unprecedented. Between 1941 and 1945, Britain received approximately 300,000 trucks and utility vehicles under Lend-Lease. They were produced in factories that operated around the clock, using interchangeable parts and simplified designs. Assembly lines turned out vehicles in hours rather than days. American industry emphasized quantity, repairability, and standardization. British planners quickly adapted. Entire logistics doctrines shifted to accommodate American vehicles. Spare parts depots were reorganized. Training manuals were rewritten. Fuel consumption estimates were recalculated. In North Africa, the ability to move supplies across hundreds of miles of desert depended almost entirely on American trucks. At El Alamein in 1942, British 8th Army logistics relied heavily on U.S.-built transport to maintain tempo. In Normandy in 1944, British formations advancing inland were supplied by columns of American vehicles operating from the beaches. The Red Ball Express is often remembered as an American operation, but British units ran parallel systems using the same truck designs. Yet this scale came with dependencies. These vehicles were not British-owned. They were loaned under strict legal terms. When the war ended, those terms would matter. Technically, Lend-Lease equipment was to be returned, destroyed, or paid for after hostilities ceased. Consumables were excluded. Trucks were not. In September 1945, the United States abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. No transition period. No gradual handover. One day the program simply stopped. Britain was left with tens of thousands of American trucks spread across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the home islands. Some were worn beyond economic repair. Others were nearly new. All were subject to post-war accounting. The immediate problem was identification and recovery. Vehicles were scattered across depots, field parks, and abandoned forward areas. Records were incomplete. Serial numbers were missing. Some trucks had been cannibalized to keep others running. In Germany, British occupation forces used American trucks daily to supply garrisons and displaced persons camps. Returning them all was impossible. The next problem was cost. Britain was effectively bankrupt. Wartime debts exceeded £21 billion. Dollar reserves were nearly exhausted. Paying for hundreds of thousands of trucks at market value was not an option. Negotiations with the United States began almost immediately. American policy was pragmatic but firm. Equipment that remained usable would either be returned or sold. Equipment deemed surplus or uneconomical to ship could be scrapped locally but under American supervision. In many cases, shipping a truck back across the Atlantic costs more than its residual value. As a result, thousands of Lend-Lease trucks were destroyed in place. In Europe, British engineers dismantled vehicles at temporary scrapyards. Engines were drained, frames were cut, axles were removed. Photographic evidence shows long lines of trucks awaiting destruction, their tires slashed, their bodies stripped. This was not punishment. It was accounting. In India and the Middle East, similar scenes occurred. Vehicles that had crossed deserts and jungles were reduced to scrap metal. Local reuse was limited by legal restrictions. Trucks could not simply be given away or sold domestically without settlement. At home in Britain, the situation was different. The civilian economy desperately needed transport. Pre-war lorry fleets had been overworked or lost. Rail freight capacity was insufficient. British manufacturers could not immediately replace losses. American trucks represented a solution if ownership could be transferred. In 1946, negotiations culminated in the Anglo-American Financial Agreement. As part of the settlement, Britain agreed to purchase selected Lend-Lease equipment at discounted rates. Thousands of trucks were absorbed into civilian service. They were repainted, re-registered, and sold to haulage firms, farmers, and municipal services. Throughout the late 1940s, American-built trucks became a common sight on British roads. They hauled coal, construction materials, agricultural produce. Their fuel consumption was higher than British designs, but their reliability was valued. Spare parts were initially abundant due to wartime stockpiles. Over time, however, challenges emerged. These trucks were designed for wartime conditions, not long-term civilian economy. They were heavy. They required skilled maintenance. As British industry recovered, domestic designs became more efficient. By the early 1950s, many former Lend-Lease trucks were worn out. Some were exported again, this time to developing countries. Others were broken up. A small number survived into preservation. From an Allied investigative perspective, the trucks were not a technological mystery. Post-war reports by American and British logistics officers emphasized their success in mass production and standardization. They were praised not for innovation, but for reliability under extreme conditions. Soviet observers, who had received even larger numbers of American trucks under Lend-Lease, drew similar conclusions. Mobility won wars. Production scale mattered as much as weapon performance. A tank without fuel and ammunition was useless. A truck ensured both. Historically, Britain's experience with Lend-Lease trucks left a lasting mark. Post-war military procurement emphasized standardization and interoperability. The British Army adopted doctrines that assumed large-scale motor transport. Civilian haulage was reorganized along more centralized lines. Yet there was also a quieter lesson. Britain had fought and won a global war using vehicles it did not own, fuel it could not pay for, and industrial output it could not match. The trucks symbolized both victory and dependency. By the mid-1950s, most Lend-Lease trucks were gone, their steel recycled, their paperwork closed, their presence forgotten outside specialist circles. Today, a few survive in museums and private collections, their olive paint restored, stencils carefully reapplied. They are displayed as artifacts of wartime logistics, not post-war accounting. But most left no trace. Turning to that quiet port in 1945, the trucks eventually disappeared. Some were sold, others dismantled. Their departure was unrecorded, their end unremarked. They had done their job. They had carried a nation through war. And when peace came, they were quietly erased. The war ended with victory parades and speeches. The trucks ended with ledgers, cutting torches, and silence.